Our gospel reading for today's teaching comes from the book of John, chapter 7, verses 20 through 23, and Psalm 133. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one even as we are one. In them and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and love them even as you loved me.
Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life evermore. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. Read an interview a couple weeks ago with Wood Harris, who a very acclaimed actor, and was asked about his role in the TV show The Wire, which is one of the most acclaimed TV shows ever to be, probably one of the most significant things HBO ever did. And was asked about why that show succeeded so well. Why did it just hit in every season despite changing the cast, sort of changing the themes, changing the storyline. And Wood Harris said this. He said, "We went to work on that show every day just trying to be great without an ego." He said the show accomplished a lot of ego-free performances. Nobody thought of anything but the script or task at hand. It's not always like that. In fact, it's rarely like that. But with that cast, we were one. Look, don't you want to be a part of something like that? Because Jesus yearns for you to be a part of something like that. And he yearns for you to experience that in a church like this, but not just rarely, not just periodically. He longs for that and yearns for that to be something that we regularly experience. If you've not been coming, what we're looking at here at the book, at this church, is the book of John, looking at chapter 17 at this prayer called the High Priestly Prayer of Jesus. It's the last thing that he sort of says and prays through the night before he dies. And we've said this, the night before that you die, you don't just have meaningless thoughts. You don't just have meaningless conversations. The most significant things that you want to think through, believe, and talk about, that's what's on your mind. That's what's on your heart. And what we have are the things that Jesus most wants for his people. What he most wants for this church, and what he gives us this morning in this text, what he yearns for us to experience, have, is unity. That we would be one. So let's look at this thing that Jesus wants for us, to be unified. And let's see it under three headings. One, there's a precursor to unity. Two, let's understand the nature of unity. And three, let's observe the power to get it. So first, there's a precursor to unity. Two, the nature of it. And three, the actually power to get unity. First, there's a precursor to unity. So Jesus prays in this text twice in our little passage, and a third time, actually at the very beginning of the text in John 17, he prays that we would be one. Now, right away, this assumes that you and I are not one, and actually that we don't want to be one. See, we're told in Genesis chapter 2, at the very beginning of the Bible, that human beings were actually created in real unified community, that we were created to be one. It says Adam and Eve were made together, they were naked and unashamed. That means they weren't just physically naked, but the Hebrew word there is that they were fully revealed. Everything was exposed. There was vulnerability and no shame. And it's speaking intimately about their marriage, but it speaks to all of human community when it says they came together and they were one flesh. But the moment that the fall happened, what happened is it sent a bass note at the subtlety of our hearts, where every time we go into community, there's an opportunity for it. There is a bass note of pride and fear. So that when we walk into a room like this, and you walk into a church, or you walk into a social setting, we don't look at these people and just go, wow, look at all these people to bless and love and care for. No, we immediately profile people. We immediately go into like marking people up and categorizing them and writing off half the room almost right away. Last year for my oldest son's 16th birthday, he's a die-hard Formula One fan. So we got him tickets to the Formula One race in Austin, Texas. And he and I went to the race. It was an amazing event. And at the end, they just opened the gates and let everybody on the track. I mean, it's it's hundreds of thousands of people there. And you're moving onto the track, and it's just shoulder to shoulder. And you're just squeezing through a fence, migrating up to the part where they're going to unveil the trophies and stuff like that. But as you're like squirming through these people, I'm looking out, making sure I can keep up with my 16-year-old who's like 4 rows ahead of me of people. We're walking, and it's not like our arms are locked in, like, brothers and sisters, how we dwell together in unity. I'm thinking, don't die. And if something happens to you, tough luck. I'm just out there for him and making sure he and I are okay. Now, in our practical lives, that's something we do all the time, and it seems so benign, like a little pebble on a road. But if you take your little pebble of walking in a community in a crowd and just going, I've just got to make sure I'm okay, and those that I immediately love are okay, that little pebble stacked up on humanity with every single person that you know of becomes a wall of alienation. And what Jesus is praying for is that wall to be broken down. He prays this in verse 23. He prays that they may become perfectly one. That's what it says in the ESV. And this translation, it doesn't quite get across the idea, I think, that what Jesus is praying here. Because he prays, the word there for perfect is the Greek word tetelumeni. It's a present passive participle. And what it is trying to get across is not the degree of their unity, that they would be a perfect one, like as if the unity will be perfect. He's basically saying what will happen to them if they become one. So what Jesus is praying is that, Lord, I pray that they may be perfected together in unity. Because for a human being, look, the brokenness that has come into our lives, it's not just vertical, it's horizontal. So that what the base note of sin is from the Bible is that you and I have an alienation from God and rebellion, where we do not want a God over us to speak to us, to be the Lord of our life and have the final voice about how life is supposed to go. And we're suspicious of our human beings. And the way that God wants to put back the alienation that started in the garden that we have from other people is in this thing called the church. That when we gather together and we live life in community that is built on the prophetic word of Jesus and the priestly ministry of Jesus and the kingly ministry of Jesus all together as he is the Christ, and we live this life out in the church, he is saying that alienation that we experience is being reversed. And that curved in part of our heart is being healed so that you and I are being made perfect and coming together in unity. And the precursor for all of unity and you being healed in that is that you've got to get back into the church. That this is not like something you add on to your faith. It's not a sort of hyper faith. That the basic way that you are healed from the curse of the garden is that you are brought back into community with other human beings and experience Jesus through it. And the precursor to unity is that you've got to get in the church. Secondly, though, there's a nature of unity that we've got to understand and see what Jesus is talking about. Because he prays that we would be one. Now, what does it actually look like for us to be one? Because almost everybody who has had anything to do with faith or anything to do with the church imagines what Jesus is praying is that we would all go to SoFi Stadium together. We would just get rid of these denominations. We would throw out, creeds and all sorts of teaching, and we could just all come together and just sing songs, and we would be one, and the city would see it and they have their minds blown. But I just don't think that's what Jesus is after or praying for. The most significant thing happening right now in the culture, if you've heard this or seen this, Barbieheimer, is that how you say it? If you've not heard of this, it's like a movie about a body-shaming Mattel doll and the father of the atom bomb. And everybody is taking these two ideas, which I'm imagining are drastically different types of cultures of people that would go to these movies, and they're all coming together and seeing these movies in back-to-back, and the movie theaters are just flooded with people seeing both of these and coming together, and I don't think we're looking at it and going, behold how they love one another. We're just intrigued by that. Look, a denomination in the church is actually not a bad thing at all. I actually think it protects us from being cult-like. This is a great thing about being a Christian, is that it's an old saying by a German teacher that says, may we have unity in the essentials, liberty in the non-essentials, and charity in all things. And what that just means is that there are things in the church that you do not have to agree with, that we have some main teachings and some secondary teachings, and there are things that we disagree with other brothers and sisters, and that does not mean we're not unified with them. Because the unity that Jesus is going after, it is not built organizationally, and nor is it imagined institutionally. It's built on the character of God himself, because Jesus says, may they be one just as you and I are one. And when he thinks about the unity and the character of God, there's really probably two categories where we could talk about this, and that's the truth and the love of God. That unity, it's built on theological essentials and loving responsibilities. Here's what I mean. Psalm 133 says this, behold how good it is when brothers dwell together in unity. But then it says 3 times, it gives some metaphors, how it is like the oil running down Aaron's beard, and then running down his robe, and then like the dew that falls down on Hermon. 3 times it says in that psalm about descending. And what the psalmist is getting at is it says this unity, this beautiful thing that we're experiencing, this is not something we created. This is not a man-made sort of construction. It is something that comes straight down to us from God. That it is a replication of his character, it's a replication of himself, and that is so different and so drastically unique from how we in the culture want to think about cultivating unity. Because here's the current two approaches going after unity in our culture. One is we want truth without love. Truth at the expense of unity, or unity at the expense of truth. Here's what I mean. Truth at the expense of unity. Look, one way people have found to want to live together in harmony and found to try to find unity and community is to only surround yourself with like-minded people. That is, if you've got to agree with me on the most essential things in life and the secondary things in life, and if there's any disagreement with you, I cannot imagine being in a relationship with you because you'll trigger me, and I won't have peace, and I won't have joy, and I won't have harmony. But unity at the expense of truth, like there's probably no better way for us to think about this than the old song, John Lennon's song Imagine. You remember the lyrics of this? It says this, imagine there's no heaven. Imagine there's no countries to fight for and no religion too. And then he sings, I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. And many have called that sort of the hymn of the secular. And it's sort of stayed with us to the point, if you remember that at the beginning of quarantine, was tried to be sort of an encouragement hymn sent out to all of the culture to just rally us to be together. But the problem with these, is multitude. The problem with truth at the expense of unity is that it's cultish, that it creates tone-deaf echo chambers and creates such a large distance from your neighbor, that people you disagree with, that you don't just see them as people who you cannot be encouraged by, but they are people who become your enemies, and you eventually hate them. And the problem with unity at the expense of truth is that it just never really works. See, when you get rid of discovered truth out there to build unity around, what ends up happening is you have created truth. And so what ends up happening is you have a truth that is only good for you. If you want truth, it's something you have to create on your own. You have to go build it out of something deep in your desires and hope that the world affirms it. But when you create truth that way, it's inherently selfish. And so what ends up happening is that we all are crying for unity, but we are mistaking unity for the need for affirmation. And when you mistake unity for affirmation, what ends up happening is you create an idea of unity built on something that can never withstand criticism, suffering, or controversy. But truth outside of your own desires for it, and unity that's built on something that's concrete and real, turns it in the midst of suffering, in the midst of disagreements, in the midst of controversy, like paper to a brick in the midst of a rainstorm. C.S. Lewis said that when he hated Christianity, that one of the things that most troubled him about Christianity, when he was resistant to it and writing against it and despising it, was that how its core beliefs and its truths maintained through generations. That as he read people from the early Greeks to the Middle Ages to the Reformation and found way too much symmetry. And it troubled him and it kept him awake at night. Here's what he said. He said, even when I feared and detested Christianity, I was struck by its essential unity, which in spite of its divisions, it has never lost it. I trembled on recognizing the same aroma, unmistakable, coming from the writings of Dante and Bunyan, Aquinas and Law. Seek unity, and you will find neither truth nor unity. Seek the light of truth, and you will find unity and truth. See, what Christian unity is it is something built on a common confession about Jesus, a rock truth that will not change, that will blast through cultures, it will blast through languages, it will blast through time. And it's saying people who believe and come together around that, that's what unity will be built around. And I'll tell you what, for as many churches are, if they're in LA, if you're discouraged and wondering about unity in the church, if you take the Apostles' Creed, you could probably take that to about 3/4 of the churches around Los Angeles and get most churches to confess and agree with that. And if you take that same creed and you go all around the world for the past several hundred years, you would begin to see almost 90% of churches begin to say, yes, we agree and confess the same thing. And if you really look into the last 2,000 years and realize that there have been famines, wars, persecution, all kinds of divisions and sins and problems, languages, cultures of all kinds that are different, and we've confessed and held on to that, you would become convinced of Christian unity. Because it's built on something that God gave us in His Son, in the truth of the gospel. But it's not just in His truth, it's also in loving responsibilities. That is, the unity that Jesus envisions for us, it's not institutional, but it is meant to be observable. That when we talk about unity, it's not just closing our eyes and imagining we could be friends with other kinds of people. It's things that people can observe and experience and see, how are these people coming together? And you know what? The New Testament gives us some incredible examples of what this would look like. I'll give you a few. One, loving responsibility and unity comes to fruition when people share resources. Look, one of the most powerful testimonies in the book of Acts in the early church was how Christians came together and gave to each other. You know, when you get in a family, or when you're newly married, you know, one of the most shocking moments is that your money is no longer your money. You either have a very abrupt wake-up call to that, or you go to counseling. But, you know, after a while, you discover that the money that you make, the money that comes in, it's not your money, it's your family's money. And what the early church did is not just think about their immediate husbands, wife, and children that way, but the entire community of faith. They began to say, if somebody's in need, if somebody has a problem, if there's something to address, it's not just they will do that and we'll pray for them. We will address this. That we will share our resources, we will come together and be one, not just theoretically, but monetarily. A second example, we will carry spiritual burdens. Look, so much of the world around us, have friendships that seem fruitful for a while, but then somebody goes through something emotional, physical, or relational, and it's just too much. And people will say, hey, I just need to focus on me right now. This is just a real me time. And what you're going through, I hope it goes well, but I don't have the skills, or I don't have the knowledge to sort of walk you through this. But the Apostle Paul says something really fascinating in Galatians 6. He's talking about somebody going through something very broken and something very sinful in the church. And he doesn't just say, pray for them. He says, carry their burdens. And the word for carry there is a Greek word that means to strap it on your back. Imagine going on a camping trip with somebody, and they show up and they've got something that is overwhelming them and clearly not something that they're able to carry on their own. And Paul says what it means to be in the church is to look at them carrying that thing and say, not only should we share it, but you give it to me. And we will walk with this together. And then when we get to the campsite, we're going to unpack this heavy thing that I've been carrying, and all the tools and resources that we brought on this trip, we're going to unpack it, and we're going to use it and experience this together. Basically, one of the most profound ways that you become one with somebody is by jumping into their problems. This is why you have got to be in a community group. Because if there's not somebody's issue, and there's not somebody's story that troubles you Monday through Saturday, you're living an individual Los Angeles life. Because what it means to begin to live as one is to look at other people's problematic stories and enter into it in some sort of way. A third example Paul gives us, racial reconciliation. Racism is birthed out of an insecurity that has defined your identity in something as superficial as your nationality and skin color. But, in the Ephesians church, Paul has this group of people who are Gentiles and these people who are Jews, and they both confess the name of Jesus and will not have fellowship to one another. And Paul says, if you believe the gospel and you put your faith in Jesus, it is the same Lord of them. And that means the moment that you believe, you have more in common with somebody who holds on to the name of Jesus and confesses that creed than you do with people who look like you, talk like you, and might even be in your own immediate family. That one of the ways you know that the gospel is alive and at work and in a community is races and cultures of people who do not naturally get along together. And let's be honest, how that's not happening in our city with the way that people migrate into like-minded neighborhoods and like-looking neighborhoods. One of the ways that you see the Spirit at work is when you begin to see relationships and fellowship happening that cross that and reverse that and actively pursue unity in the midst of that. A fourth example that the New Testament gives is just deep forgiveness. There is nothing that causes greater schism in the church than anger and hatred. Is when somebody hurts you, when there's deep embedded sin that causes pain in people's lives. There is nothing that causes a greater, wider, longer schism than when we just give in to it. And cancel culture in our world exists because there is no resources for forgiveness. But what Jesus longs for, when he's praying that we would be one, one of the applications he has to be praying for is that we would look at relationships that everybody would have a right to walk away from and say, I will not walk away from this. That I will take the gospel and go after this and pursue it and find healing. Because unity in the faith is only possible if you're willing to work through sinful, painful situations, because they're going to happen. As I begin to minister to you with this in this church, you've got to know, I'm going to hurt you. And I'm going to frustrate you. And mutually, probably that will happen. But what makes the Christian church so unique is when we say on the front end, we will be one. And the only way you do that is in the power of forgiveness. See, unity, it is built out of the confession of truth and out of the loving responsibilities that people take on to pursue it in the midst of pain and suffering and hardship. And you know what Jesus says in verse 21 is that when we do that, when we live that out, he says, then the world will know, Father, that you sent me. That is the greatest testimony, the greatest work of evangelism that we can give for our city, for our neighborhoods, is when you and I actively hold on to loving responsibilities when everyone else would walk away. I'll give you an amazing example of this. You may know the name Malcolm Gladwell, a very renowned author. He's a man who grew up around the church and then left it in college in the midst of academia and secularism and lived that life for quite a while. But as he was in the midst of that, he was doing some research for a book called David and Goliath that he wrote. And as he was working on that, he came across a couple named Cliff and Wilma Dirksen. And Cliff and Wilma had had their daughter Candace, who was their only daughter, taken from them. She was kidnapped, she was tortured, and she was murdered. And so Malcolm goes to visit with these people and talks to them about their daughter and their story, and he asks them about what do they think about the murderer who was caught. And this is what they said. Cliff said, he said, how do you feel about whoever did this? Cliff said, we would like to know who the person or the persons are so we could share, hopefully, a love that seems to be missing in these people's lives. His wife then said, our main concern was to find our daughter, but we found her. At this point, I'm struggling with the idea of forgiveness, but haven't we all done something dreadful in our lives, or at least felt the urge to? Forgiveness is our only way forward. And Malcolm Gladwell said, in watching them process this and go through this, he said, in the midst of their garden, this ordinary person did something absolutely extraordinary. That in the midst of hell, what she was thinking about is how do I reconcile and pursue healing and forgiveness in this relationship? And Malcolm came back to faith because of that moment. There is nothing louder for the gospel than you looking at some way in some person where the world would write them off and saying, we will be one. And when Jesus is saying, Lord, I pray that they would be one just as you and I would, he's after that. Look, the precursor for unity is that you've got to get out of your little individual expressive life and come into the church. But secondly, the nature of the unity that Jesus wants after, it is after a common confession of the gospel, expressing itself in love. So that when we have truth without love, that's condemnation. But love without truth, that's accommodation. And Jesus says, live it out both for the world so that they can see that the Father and I will one, and then they will want to be one with you. So thirdly, how do we actually get that? How do we get the unity that Jesus wants us to have? Look, the way you connect with somebody is if something is true about the both of you. But the problem with the world is that we build this on the most superficial of things that don't ever last. Look, this is why if you have a friendship with somebody and it's built on biking or working out, when they move, it's hard to keep up with it. But you know what? One of the mistakes we make is that when you move out of that and you see through the superficiality of that, you can come into something like this in the church and think you're building friendships on something more profound, but you've only found not the gospel, but religion. See, religion is our attempt to live a nice, pleasing life for God to accept us. And if that's the way that you come into the church and that's what you think about Christianity, that is the greatest threat to unity in this church. Because what happens is when people begin to think that the way to get to God is for us to live a nice, pleasing life and everybody to believe and think just like me, then what will happen is the moment you have somebody who has a question about some of the convictions and has a doubt about some of the convictions, or they struggle to live the nice, pleasing life before God, we don't enter into their pain. We don't seek to answer their questions. And we rarely need to figure out if there's forgiveness on the table. We just write them off. And we just throw them away. And we call it Christianity, but it's mistaking it for religion. See, what the gospel does, though, is it doesn't bring people together because they're right. It brings people together because they finally admitted we're just wrong. And it doesn't bring us together because we're living a nice, pleasing life. It brings us together because we realize we can't and we need healing. See, Christian unity, it works like this. It works like you finally sobering up to all the things that you've been lying to yourself and everyone else about, and realizing there's only one person who can heal this, forgive this, and set me forward, and that's Jesus. And when you begin to believe that and becomes the most profound reality in your life, and you meet somebody, and they begin to talking about the same thing, you go, oh, you too? That's how you find unity. The Apostle Paul talks about this ministry of reconciliation in 2 Corinthians 5. He says, we have been given the gospel, which is a ministry built on reconciliation. And at every moment when unity is needed in life, look, somebody has to make the first move. Look, if you're racially suspicious, or you know somebody's got a need, or there's something hard between the two of you and you're on the outs, somebody has to take the first step and get vulnerable and be willing to pursue the unity. In the gospel, the way the ministry of reconciliation that Paul talks about works is it's not as though God and I come together and say, okay, let's agree on this. You're holy. I'll admit it, but I'll ask for forgiveness and then you'll grant it. No. What the gospel says is that while we were dead in our trespasses, God came after us and made us alive. That he fully pursues all himself. He makes himself vulnerable. So that Paul says this, he who knew no sin became sin so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This is what happens in the gospel and the ministry of reconciliation, is that while we were chasmed from God, totally separate, Jesus said, I'll be vulnerable. I'll take on all their consequences. I'll go live their life. I'll get rejected. I'll get rused. I'll get thrown out. Why? Because I'm so passionate about being one with them, I'm willing to throw myself out there even if they never come back. And Paul says, look, that's how God comes after you and makes it possible for us all to be one. And you want to know why you and I can do that, why we can be that way. Because Jesus prays this in verse 22. He says, Lord, the glory that you gave me, I'm giving it to them. You ever wonder what is this glory that Jesus talked about? It can't be this sort of pre-existent eternal glory that only exists amongst Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because it's something he had in his life and he wanted us to experience. I'll tell you what I think it is. He's talking about this intimate, incredible relationship that he had with the Father. That is, the Father loved Jesus in a way all of us dream about. He loved him just as he was. He sung over him. He cherished him. He loved him with a perfect love forever and ever and ever. Do you know why unity is such a threat to you and I? It's because we are so insecure and we are so afraid that we are not loved. We have to protect ourselves or elevate ourselves above other people. But Jesus says, I pray that they would know that they are loved with a perfect love, just as you love me. Look at me. God loves you. And he loves you to the degree he loves Jesus. Just as you are, he loves you. Let's go live together in the power of that love together. Let me pray. Father, that we would be one. Only in the power of the gospel. Lord, would you help us? Would you enable us to do things that make no sense in the natural secular world? Lord, to pursue relationships, to give, to forgive, to be friendship with people who make no sense to be friends with, were it not for the reality of who you are. Father, you love us just as you love Jesus. Help the doubting heart. Help the hardened heart. Help the fearful heart to believe that right now. You love us just as you love him. Amen.